Hey, Dave Kittle here. Welcome back to the Dave Kittle Show. Today we have Denis Shapiro, a real estate investor, on the podcast. And in terms of me, I'm the practice owner of Concierge Pain Relief Home Physical Therapy in New York City and the CEO of the Fieldmaker Group. We're currently acquiring physical therapy practices in the New York and New Jersey area. Denis, what's going on?
Hey, Dave. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time. Denis is very, very active on LinkedIn. That's how he and I connected. He is also the author of the Alternative Investment Almanac. You can find that on Amazon. And he helps investors reach their investment goals through alternative investments. And today, the episode title, we're going to cover why you should invest in traditional and alternative assets, not one or the other. So just to start off, we'll get into your background, but what does that mean, particularly the headline there?
So what ends up happening is I speak to a lot of different investors, and there's always been this kind of two avatars of investors. One of them is your traditional guy, and they are the ones with the financial advisors. They only do stocks and bonds. And if you ever mention like alternative or private, they'll end up saying like, oh, that sounds like a Ponzi scheme or this or that. And they roll their eyes, and that's basically it. And then there are people who transitioned over to the alternative side, and they invest in real estate, and they say, well, real estate is just so beneficial. There's tax benefits, there's depreciation, there's all these different, there's the passivity involved, and all these great, and cash flow and appreciation. So I would never go and put my money in the roulette, so to say, of Wall Street. And when I wrote my book, the Alternative Investment Almanac, I really want to bridge that gap, because I come from a background where I started off on the traditional side. I've progressed through a lot of different baby steps onto the alternative side. And then now looking back at it, I kind of see that my main issue throughout this whole journey was that I always looked at it as an or, because I was always surrounded by people who were either that side or that side. And I would be like, well, if I take away money from my public securities, then I can't put that, or I could put money in more into the private, or vice versa. And I always had that or relationship between the two. When I started looking at it as more of an and relationship, and how the pros and cons of traditional investments actually complement the pros and cons of alternative investments, I feel like my philosophy really, really changed, took a whole nother gear. And I felt like I became a much better investor when I did do that.
Got it. And then in terms of traditional versus alternative assets, would you agree that there's a little bit for the investor side, there's maybe a little bit more control over like the decision making or where the focus is for that investment, as opposed to traditional investment, you put it in Vanguard, you put it in somewhere, and it's just like you have no idea what's going on? Like, is that a good jump off point in terms of like an investor has somewhat a little bit more control, or maybe like the focus is more narrow? Like, how would you describe that?
So I would be careful about using the word control, but I would instead say that alternative investments allow you to leverage your own personal experiences to stack the deck in your favor. For example, if you are a physician, with alternative investments, let's say you're in the traditional space and you're investing in stocks and options, and yeah, you could probably put in a healthcare REIT, but realistically speaking, you're not really leveraging your own extensive background to actually profit yourself, right? You're kind of still putting it in the hands of someone else. On the alternative side, you could turn around and you could buy someone else's practice, being a physician, and use your background actually give yourself a better chance of, profiting off of that. So I guess you could use it interchangeably, but I think the main thing is you could actually leverage your knowledge, which I always found puzzling why sometimes, the most affluent network, really intelligent people, way smarter than I am, but they'll choose to invest into something completely not related to their actual background and what made them successful in the first place. Versus, where the stock market is kind of like, yeah, you do roll your dice, but if you do it smart, you can still benefit in the long term with, long-term appreciation trends.
Got it. And so one of the reasons I wanted you to come on is because I liked your content on LinkedIn, and I follow it pretty closely. And with the audience here of being practice owners, they're selling some or all their practice. They're either taking some chips off the table, they're selling, in some cases, maybe 70 or 80% of their practice, and the corporate or the bigger buyer is having them retain 20 or 30%, roll over equity or something like that. Or in some cases, the practice owners, at least in the Northeast, but across the country, it's happening, where they're exiting their practice and they're selling 100% of their practice. So they're most likely going to have a lot of liquid cash where they need to put it, whether it's hundreds of thousands, probably millions, and depending on how many partners and their scale and all that. And so I wanted to have you come on because this is not investment advice. You'll have to speak with Dennis and your own, investment professionals, your own wealth advisor, health, your financial advisors, all of that. But I wanted to bring on someone like Dennis to say, like, okay, so here's, as opposed to just like you sell some or all of your practice and you put it into some stocks that you haven't really done any real due diligence or have no real knowledge of the workings of the stock prices, and do you have the stomach for the volatility and all the stuff that's happening in the market. Let me have someone like Dennis come on and explain some other options, some other ways to look at things. So in terms of other things that either you've learned through your experiences or even authoring the book, I know you had interviewed other folks for the book as well. What are any additional components in terms of like learnings that you've learned either before COVID or even now coming through COVID in like what you see in the investment landscape?
That's a great question. So I guess the question is, if someone's selling their practice, how you should approach that capital event. Is that like a good summary of what you're trying to ask?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So a lot of times someone at that point either has a team or is doing it solo. So I said, if you have a team, you got to really rely on your knowledge on the team. Now, I would be careful because, again, the traditional sense is if you go to a financial advisor and they're all about assets under management or whatever it is, they're gonna, I guess, sell you, let's say, a certain box of potential investments. I think as someone who is highly educated, ran a successful business, you have to understand that there's always options beyond that. And it's not to say that those options are better than the options that the financial advisors give you. It's just that they're different options. And then what you need to do is, given your own age, your own circumstances, are you looking to go back and doing another practice right away? Are you looking to, hey, I burnt out. That's the reason why I sold the practice. So now I want to go easy for 10, 20 years. So I just want to write out the checks, receive the dividends, and that's it. But the cool thing is, it's whichever way you want to go, there are so many different options out there when you start getting into more of the alternative space. And I'll give you an example. So in the alternative world is you are dealing with what they call private securities, and almost anything in business can become a private security. That means if it's a landscaping company or a winery I've seen, or an RV park, all of those could become securities. And if it's something that you're passionate about, you could actually get involved in those projects. A good example that I know of is there's a winery about an hour south from me. And one of the partners that came in was an ex-Wall Street guy. And he came in and his lifetime dream was actually to own a winery. But he didn't know the first steps of actually owning a winery. So he teamed up with more or less a real estate guy who knew how to bundle people's money together. And the real estate guy ended up buying this winery. The Wall Street guy joined the partnership team of this real estate guy. And now collectively, even though the Wall Street guy is not involved with the day-to-day operations, he got to fulfill his life dream of buying a winery. He brought in a lot of his Wall Street investor friends into the project as well. So he ended up then creating like a second career for himself, like kind of this investor relations, but giving tours at the winery. So he gets to do what he wants. So I guess the long story short is, if you end up just selling your practice, giving it to your financial advisor, and then trying to figure out what to do with your life, would that make you happier than getting involved with maybe something in the private space? And I'm not telling anybody, because it's not financial advice, of exactly how to do it. I kind of give out more of the framework in the book, but a lot of it's just about networking. But can you imagine a scenario where your life goal was owning a winery, and because of alternative investments and because of you becoming familiar with private securities, now the door opens for you to actually own that part of the winery and leave the operations to a certain operator. And I think that's kind of where the sky is. Where the potential is unlimited when you do have capital, you do have a passion. Alternative investments, private securities is the ultimate marriage between the both.
What would be a good place for someone to either learn more about their options? So so you're saying financial advisor, wealth advisor, they pretty much like have like their go-to game plan in terms of like some package or some portfolio of funds or stocks and bonds and things like that, right? So like as a practice owner that's listening, if they're thinking about selling in the near future, if they have already exited and sold some or all of their practice, like, is there other investment professionals that they could consult with, speak with to learn more about their options on the alternative side of things?
Absolutely. So here's kind of my blueprint to the process. And first, make sure you actually have some time, because a lot of, let's say, real estate operators out there, they're really good marketers and they love to say it's 100% passive. And if you really believe that, then you're kind of gambling at that point. So just understand you have to do this in a position in your life where where you need to allocate some time into actually your education of the space. So that's the first thing. Like, I hate when people are like, "Oh, this is 100% passive." I'm like, "Okay, so you just want to wire someone 550, 200,000 and you want to label it 100% passive, then you're kind of gambling." So the first kind of step is to making sure you actually have that time allocation to actually learn what the fundamentals of a private security are. The good thing is the learning curve is really quick. Like, if you start dedicating some time, within a year to two, you're going to get more proficient in reading PPMs, some of the projected returns, learning what a cap rate is, and all these different things that keep repeating, regardless if you're doing office buildings or private practices or wineries. All of these things kind of keep repeating. So the first thing to do, get that time allocation. The second thing to do, really easy, is start telling people what you're actually passionate about. So, if you're dreaming of owning a winery, talk about it, because someone knows someone who knows someone. The other way I kind of do it is go into like LinkedIn, and underneath where your profile is, just change it to whatever you're interested in doing. If you want to become a crypto investor, just put crypto investor. What that ends up doing is LinkedIn is full of people scouring and virtual assistants scouring and just looking for that. And then all of a sudden, you're going to start getting requests to get on these 15-minute calls. And now a lot of those requests, I would say like 90 to 99% of them are going to be basically sales calls. But what that's going to allow you to do is those are sales calls in the space that you're interested in learning about. So that's going to allow you to start learning key terms that you need to know. And what ends up happening is you don't want to just go out and say, "Oh, I want to be a crypto investor. What's the biggest crypto conference there is? I'm going to go there and I'm going to network with a whole bunch of people and everything is going to work out for me." What ends up happening is if you don't take the steps in educating the basic knowledge, basic language of that space, you're going to go to the conference and you're going to come off as "help me, help me, help me." And what happens is when you come off like that, you detract people, versus if you go to that conference and you've already spent the time on those LinkedIn calls or educating yourself alternatively, you would at least have that basic understanding. So when you go to that crypto conference or the real estate conference or the family office conference, whatever it is, you have a basic understanding of the terms being used. So when you do offer to share your contact information, it comes off as, "Hey, I want to connect with my peer going forward. Here's my information. Let's talk every quarter. You're looking to invest into crypto. I'm looking to invest in crypto. Why don't every quarter we get together and you tell me what you're seeing in the crypto market, and I'll tell you what I see in the crypto market." And you end up getting 5 of those type of connections. And in a year, you're going to be in a completely different space. But you need to take those couple of steps first, because otherwise it's really about gambling, versus when you take those spaces, you get to really know people, and those people will eventually refer you. Like, I didn't know a winery that was raising money. That's not how it works. I wasn't just driving by and randomly stopped at this winery and went in and said, "Oh, by the way, are you raising money?" It was through an apartment building investor that I invested in. And And they are the ones that told me. And it was because I was having a conversation with them and they thought it would be interesting. So have those conversations with those people who are also interested in going to the same path as you are.
Yeah, that's great advice. Awesome. And then what are some of the other highlights? I don't want to give away too much because I want to give the opportunity for the audience to check out your book. But what are some of the other components to maybe other highlights from your book that you learned in terms of authoring the almanac? Is some components around real estate, some components around life insurance and other policies, other investment vehicles. Investing in startups, I think, was something that I saw in one of your pieces of content somewhere. Maybe it was even investing in small businesses, but any other highlights in terms of the alternative side?
Yeah. So the one thing, what I wanted really to get out of this book is how relatable those asset classes are versus when you have a conversation with a financial advisor, they'll black sheep the whole section of private equity, versus that the fact that the private equity world is much larger than public and there's so many different opportunities. So when I wrote this book, I think my goal was just to show the traditional investor to say like, hey, look, there is a really easy path to invest in apartment buildings, self-storage places, mobile home parks, ATM funds. It's actually not that complicated. And then once you get into the education zone and you learn what a PPM is, it's the same PPM for an ATM fund. And it's the same PPM, private placement memorandum. I wanted to make sure I actually included that. And it's the same one for every single asset class. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood, because some people are like, well, I don't have all this time. And by the time I learn about mobile home parks, I don't want to recommit myself to learning about apartment buildings. So my goal was to make this book, and the book is actually structured in a way where it'll introduce you to the actual asset class. So it's about a 15 to 20 minute read per asset class. And then it gets into Q&As with two well-known investors in the space. And the Q&A investors are different in every single chapter, but they are asked the same exact question. So you as a reader can actually see the different approaches to, hey, what do you see in 5 years for this asset class? And some investors you could see, they're like, yeah, hey, like apartment buildings, right? They're like, yeah, it's never going to go out of style. I'll do it for a lifetime. Versus ATMs, where they're like, we're constantly looking at the data between the cash circulation out there and the amount of people that don't have bank accounts. So we're month to month. So it's like getting those different approaches also help the investor to say, hey, which asset class is actually right for me, and being open-minded about it.
Very interesting. We didn't cover this in the pre-interview, but I just wanted to give you hopefully a little boost with books and get this in front of more practice owners and therapists. So what we'll do is, if you're listening or watching this on YouTube, if you comment below, hey, what's up? Thanks, Dennis, whatever, comment below, and then comment with your email address. And we'll ship you a book. We'll ship you a copy of the Alternative Investment Almanac. Shipping, everything. We'll cover whatever the shipping, whatever, if it's through Amazon, it's probably through Prime. I don't know, but we'll send out the first 25 people that comment on the YouTube video here with this interview of Denis Shapiro. We'll send you out a free copy of the book to help with engagement and to see who is interested in learning more about in the alternative investment side of things. And we'll see if that spurs a little bit. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the properties. So are you building out properties and then putting them on Airbnb, or are those private listings for rentals, or what are you specifically doing with some of your properties, like you said Bradley Beach and a few others?
Yeah, so my company is SIH Capital Group. We mainly deal with affordable housing, but we do special projects from time to time. So one of the special projects I think you're referring to is the Surf Village at Bradley Beach. So if anybody is in the New Jersey, Pennsylvania area. So this is a town about, I would say, 5 minutes away from Asbury Park. So it's in a prime location. So our goal was, we found a location that had 9 beach cottages, and we came in there and we basically completely gut renovated them, helped relocate a lot of the people that were in there, because the people that were in there were annual leaseholders. And we really went out of the way to create this incredible experience of a short-term rental where it's not your typical Airbnb. It really is an experience, and the focus, everything from start to finish, from the mattresses we selected to the cleaning products we use. Everything is for this ultimate experience of, a luxury beach cottage feel. And with these properties in different places, it's coming out phenomenal. If anybody is interested, I believe on Instagram, it's the Bradley Surf Village. But connect with me. I'll send you the information. It's been one of the most fun and interesting projects I've ever been a part of.
It's awesome. And can we talk a little bit about your fund? I know I was listening to one of your episodes, one of your interviews somewhere, and you were talking about the difference between like the closed-ended funds versus evergreen funds. And long story short, I mean, everyone in the audience will have to do like their own due diligence on all this, but like there's a lot more potentially nefarious activity for the evergreen funds where it's kind of like an ongoing, like money in, money out, and you can't really track like the returns. And it's more challenging, right, to track like the behavior and the activity and are there actual positive returns or versus like the Bernie Madoff scam or scandal where it was just like the Ponzi scheme where the new investors were paying off the older investors basically. So and your fund specifically, I believe was a closed-end fund. So is that something that you're deploying that capital now and that fund is closed? Not that we're doing capital raising or anything like right now, but is that something where it's closed and you're deploying that money right now, or is that still something that you're working on?
So that fund is currently open to only accredited investors, so we could actually mention it on the podcast. So that's a 506c fund. So we are raising for that. It's a smaller fund. It is an income fund, so it's mainly geared for investors that are really looking for capital preservation and monthly income versus total returns. So it's a little bit different. It is a closed-ended fund, like you mentioned, and just to highlight that. So what ends up happening is the industry, the private security industry, is kind of moving towards the fund model because there are certain efficiencies for the operator. For example, if you're a big apartment building operator and you close on 4 or 5 deals a year, instead of going and getting a new PPM for every single one of those deals, you do one PPM and then you're just raising for all of those deals. So it makes life a lot easier, the fund model. Now, in the fund model, there's 2 different types of funds. There's a closed-ended fund and an open-ended fund. Now, an open-ended fund technically does not have a life cycle. It could stay open, and that's where I find that there's a lot of issues with it. And versus a closed-ended fund, usually it's a very specific purpose fund. Like I did a closed-ended fund, and they said, "Hey, our goal is to buy 5 properties, exactly 5 properties. We're going to be buying in this specific area. We're going to hold them for 5 to 7 years, and we're going to be exiting." So it's a very specific timeline. You're only analyzing that. And then this is versus an open-ended fund where literally they're supposed to have what's called your net asset value, and that's supposed to be reevaluated every single month. But what ends up happening is if the fund gets big enough, it becomes a convoluted mess, and you probably need to be a forensic accountant to actually get through it. So for simplicity purposes, especially when you're starting out, an open-ended fund might seem like a good idea, but you just need to be mindful of what you're actually investing in. Is it something that in 5 years you're going to be out of, or is it going to be an ongoing thing? And a lot of newer investors kind of get blinded by the return. And usually I always tell my kind of newer investors, don't look at the returns. Returns is usually the last thing you should analyze in the deal. Look at all the fundamentals first. And if all the fundamentals are solid, the returns are usually going to be solid. So for example, like what kind of financing is in place? What's the track record of the operator? How simple is the business plan? Like factor all those things in. And if all those things check out, then look at the returns. But even then, take those with a grain of heart. Versus I have investors. I remember there was our last deal. We projected about 13 to 15%. And we had an investor and she was like, "Sorry, I can't invest. I just saw a deal come in at 25%. And we said, "Okay, no problem. It just doesn't fit. And we don't want you to have those expectations for our deal." But we always found, especially we started off as limited partners on a lot of these deals. We always found that the operators that project a 20 to 30% are the ones that underperform, and the operators that project the 13 to 15% tend to overperform.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's something in that range. You're trying to like manage expectations. You're probably trying to like undercommit and then over deliver. So then if you're projecting 13 to 15% return, and if it's above that, like your investors will be ecstatic, and then they'll tell other investors, and they'll probably continue to invest with you for other future funds and other projects.
Yeah. That the term, I always joke around about this, but the term conservative gets overused to such an excessive amount that I always just tell investors, just cross that out. It means nothing. Learn some of the basics in underwriting so you can make that judgment yourself. Because in every presentation I've seen in the last, 7 years, I've seen the word conservative on the marketing. And I think the best way just to look at it is aligning yourself with investors that share the same vision with you. So whether or not you plan on, beating 13 to 15, obviously as an operator, you want to do as best as you can, but you want investors that are looking at it and say, hey, I would be really happy with a 13 to 15% return if you average that out and you do a 10-year hold versus me getting a 20% return with someone else for 3 years and then figuring out what to do with that money in 3 years and figure out how to deal with the tax event if I don't redeploy that capital. So I think it's just all about aligning the investors to make sure that the investor that comes onto your deal is actually the right investor for that deal.
And so when you mentioned capital preservation, so is that basically a way to describe like you're not going to be losing their principal? Is that basically what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's heavily diversified, and the general partners are heavily invested in it. So yeah, the goal is to get all their money back plus a fixed monthly return, basically for the life of the deal.
Got it. So one of the lines from your Instagram, it was SIH Capital. You wrote that isn't an ideal fit for an investor who values capital preservation and steady income versus risky appreciation. So is that like, because risky appreciation, they're looking for like a bigger, like that, like the woman you mentioned, like a 20 or 25% return. But some of the projects that are either claiming that or suggesting that that's going to be the return, it there's maybe a higher likelihood that like it could hit that, but then it could like have like some catastrophic issues, right? Like versus you're trying to be like steady and almost like under promise, as opposed to having some large appealing number. But you and I all know like a lot of investments some will hit that or exceed that, and then some will go to zero.
Yeah, there's really good ratios to look at. Is how much of the total returns are coming from the cash flow of the properties, and how much is coming from the appreciation at the time of the sale. Because right now we're recording this in November 2022. The rate of interest rate increase in the last 3-4 months has been pretty much unparalleled, and the chances of those deals that you were seeing in the start of the year that projected, a 3-year exit, that's for the most part off the table with almost any operator I speak with. Like the chances of a quick exit these days are completely off the table. So it's all about operational efficiency. Now, a huge issue in the industry for the last couple of years is that in 2021, 2020, 2019, you had all these deals that exited in that, 18 months, 24 months, 30 months. And the investor that is 100% passive, they were getting maybe checks at the time, they weren't, but they see these big exits and they're just going to make the assumptions that, okay, if I reinvest with the same operator, I'm going to get the exact same long-term, I'm going to get the same return, right? So if I just got a 25% annualized return for this deal that cashed out in 2022, I'm going to get the same return next 3 years. And that's a big fallacy. And that's where the education component is so critical, because you actually have to understand where that 25% annual return came from. Did it come from something the operator actually did, or did it come from the fact that the rates were decreasing at that time, the cap rates were decreasing at that time, and a greater fool came in and just paid more for that property? Or was it really due to really great operational efficiencies, and this operator could have held this thing on for 10 years and still done as well or even better? So I think it's important today in November 2022 to really focus in on a deal, look at the returns. I can't imagine, I can't begin to tell you how many deals I've seen where other investors have brought to me and there would be no cash flow for 3 years. And they're still projecting, a huge refi in year 2 and 3, when for the most part, every operator I talk to says that's off the table right now, unless rates really normalize after these increases. Because how could you, if you're getting a deal right now at 6-7%, in 2 years, if the rates are 7-8, like you're not going to be able to go refi out that property. So I think the dynamics of being 100% passive investor is a little bit in jeopardy right now. And it's more about really understanding, do you really have a great operator that you're investing with? And if that's the case, then you're going to be fine for the next 3, 4, 5 years. There's that like golden line saying a great operator can take a bad deal and make it salvageable, and a bad operator can take the best deal and make it terrible. So make sure you understand which operator, because the next 7 to 10 years of investing is going to be very, very different than the 3 years we just exited.
Right. And so in terms of anyone in the audience that's maybe has or was looking at traditional investments, the traditional way is, would you agree, like the traditional way is like set it and forget it, like you put it into some, Vanguard, whatever, versus your investors who you have work with you, where you're probably, maybe they're coming and doing site visits, you're probably sending them a lot of updates. They're like, they're in the investment experience with you. It's like more of a personal journey, a personal ride. And like you said, it's not passive though. There's more of an active approach. The gentleman you mentioned about the winery, that takes time and effort, and you're taking your operational excellence, you're sharing your knowledge and expertise. Those investors might even be bringing their own, experience through different lines of work, and maybe that adds to operational excellence and operational efficiencies. I'm just thinking out loud here that there should be, more investors moving in the future towards a more of an active approach, versus I just think like historically over the past several decades, even my grandfather, it was just like there was just money put into different stocks, and it was just kind of like set it and forget it. So is there anything that in our culture or the investment world, like where that's shifting or changing, where individuals that have, some amount of net worth, where they're looking to be more active? Is there a shift? Was it before COVID? Was it after COVID? Is it something that there's always going to be X amount of the population that's going to do the traditional investing and X amount of the population that's going to do the alternative investing? Is there anything that you've seen that is going to, drive more people one way or the other?
Yeah, and I think this highlights actually the title of this podcast, and the reason why we want that transition, but we also want to highlight what the pros and cons is to investing in both traditional. And when I mean traditional, it's public, the stocks and bonds. And what I mean by alternative is really the private space. And what ends up happening is I started from the traditional side 20 years ago. And I realized that the pros for traditional is that you could set and forget it, right? You could buy the Vanguard index fund, very low expenses, really efficient, and it will appreciate in the long run as long as you don't panic during a sell-off. Now, on the other hand, what is the negative downside is the income from it sucks. Let's be honest. You're lucky to get 1 or 2% from a good paying income fund. Now, I thought I was a genius for those 20 years, and I went out trying to capture dividend stocks, high utility stocks, MLPs, closed-ended funds, all of these different things that were supposed to be like, oh, these things are 8 to 10% in income. And I was like, oh, if I could just marry the two between a good index fund and all these different income, I could have the perfect portfolio. And sure enough, what ended up happening is as long as those income plays were public securities, what ended up happening is you would underperform the index fund. And at the time that the market was going down and those high yielding securities were supposed to actually be defensive, the way that the algorithms take over these days, they go down just as much as the regular market. So I was like, okay, I can't get any income from this. And I scratched that whole part of my portfolio. And when I started getting more into the alternative side, I realized the alternatives were incredible for the cash flow, but where they sucked, to be honest, was the volatility, the liquidity. If you need that money, how can you actually get it? So I started realizing that, if you marry the two, you can actually take advantage of both. So what I like to do, and this is a personal strategy of mine, it's not saying everybody should go out and get it, is I like to invest a lot of my money into an index fund, and then I'll collateralize the index fund, and then they'll give me a line of credit. A lot of brokerages would do that. And then you take that line of credit and then you actually buy the low volatility, greater cash flowing private stuff. And then you use the dividends to kind of pay back that credit line. But this way you allow the traditional side to do what it's good at. And that's basically appreciate in the long run without panic selling. And then you also tie in to the alternative side, which is what it's good at, which is low volatility because it doesn't really fluctuate that much. It's steady Eddie until you sell the property or the business or whatever it is, but it'll produce that higher cash flow. And when you start thinking of it as an end, now you have that portfolio that I was looking for 20, 30 years with all these different income strategies that I was trying on the public market.
That's awesome. Really cool stuff. Really appreciate your time, Dennis. And I think this is a great place to pause for now. Definitely have you back in the future. Guys, check out his book on Amazon, The Alternative Investment Almanac. Like I said, the first 25 to comment on this episode on YouTube with your email address, we'll send you a free copy. What's a good place? So we got your website, good place for the audience to reach out to you. We got SIHcapitalgroup.com. Any other place, whether it's LinkedIn, email address, any other place for the audience to reach out if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, the website is definitely the best way because when you go on the website and you click on learn more, you'll get 2 free ebooks that have to do with the space. And if you're interested more, then just reach out. I love getting on calls. Whether or not you're just getting started in the space or you have a business or you're looking to buy a business or whatever it is, if I can't help you, I can usually point you to someone that can help. So please reach out. My email address, my personal email address is denis@SIHcapitalgroup.com.
That's awesome. So never too early for one of these professionals to reach out to you?
No, never too early. And I strongly recommend that I recommend that it's the earlier the better, because then you could start planning. And if you have a financial advisor that you really, really trust and really want to go through, I could kind of walk you through some of the steps that you would want to have those conversations with them. Like my goal is to really create that end conversation. Is basically how to make something better and how it can work with something else versus telling people like, oh no, this is the best strategy. You should abandon everything else that you like. You should, switch over CPAs. You should do this and this and that. You never really create relationships with guys like that. Well, instead really focus on the people who are trying to create that value versus trying to tell them why they're the best at what they do.
That's awesome. So for everyone listening, if you find this valuable, find this interesting, would love for you to just copy the link of this episode. If you're listening on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, send it to a colleague, send it to a friend that's a practice owner, a physician, physical therapist, someone that is interested in this type of collaboration, this type of content. And we would love to hear any feedback that you might have. Subscribe, rate, and review. Again, if you find this valuable, that's all for Dave Kittle on the Dave Kittle Show. Denis Shapiro, thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate you having me. This was a blast.
Hey, it's Dave Kittle. Are you a healthcare business owner or physical therapy practice owner who is looking to figure out your succession plan or exit strategy? We might be able to help. And in fact, we may be interested in acquiring your practice. If you're interested, you can reach out to me. Shoot me an email at dave@conciergepainrelief.com. That's DAVE@CONCIERGE painrelief.com. Or you can call me at any time, 646-781-8884.